Okay, so what we were looking at, and I would like to thank everybody in the national group for their hard work in compiling all of these reforms and projects and changes in legal codes. But what we were looking at is actually the ways that these states, these countries coped with the crisis. And these projects and these reforms are only one small part of the story. So this presentation is supposed to transcend this problem, to show all of the constricting elements that constrict policy choices in response to the crisis in each one of these countries. So one important element is institutional positions. You don't see this when you take a look at the way some law was changed, because you don't see the starting position of any of these countries. So we're going to try to contextualize this in an institutional framework. The other thing is, of course, the role of the EU, and this, in great part, I will have to leave to the next presentation, the next group. But also, we will see the effect that changes in the policy mainstream from 2010, affected largely by the EU level, constricted policy options during the second dip, the second recession dip in 2012. So, we're going to be looking at fiscal behavior, at exchange rates, and apart from that, my colleagues Colin and Daniel, they're here, will present us with summaries of labor and tax code reforms. So these are aggregates of all the work that has been done in the past 2 weeks by the national group. So hopefully when we're through, we'll get a complete overview of what was happening, complete with contextualization. And also interviews were done with politicians on the national level, so you can see two areas, austerity measures and euro adoption, where something interesting, something substantial was said. So, I was asked yesterday to be provocative a bit, to outline the idea behind all of this data. And this is as provocative as I dare to be at this point. EU, of course, needs stable and predictable macro policies. So, a loss in complexity, a loss in unpredictability. And one of these losses is, in fact, the euro. And another one is the fiscal compact. And a lot of EU reforms are directed at the stable environment. But this stable environment constricts the options of any periphery country in dealing with a recession. They will exacerbate the next recession. Okay, a common currency reduces an important maneuvering position in exchange rate policy, which determines, of course, the trade balance. If you devaluate against the euro, you should see a positive balance in the following years, and vice versa. Austerity measures will reduce the possibility of the hardest hit countries. And this is not only the idea that if you expand government spending, that you will create a stimulus, that you will correct for the loss in investment function, in the household function, that you will be able to float your country out of a recession with expansionary fiscal policies. What we're talking about here is actually, even if you want to even if you want to just remain at the level of expenditure that you had before the crisis, you just have to borrow more. So you have to go against all of these fiscal policy constriction mechanisms in the EU. So open with the way that unemployment behaved in response to the 2009 contraction. And this is something that Daniel will tell you more about in a second. But this is one of the, we can't go into the varieties of capitalism literature, and I'm saddened by this because this is one of my favorite topics, but you're just going to have to take my word for it, that there are these institutional ideal types, ways in which institutional positive externalia intertwine with other institutional positive externalia to create CMEs, coordinated market economies like Germany, and I have claimed like Croatia and like Belgium and so on, and LMEs, liberal market economies like the Commonwealth countries, so like, say, Ireland or the UK. And one of these institutional arrangements is the way the labor market works. In all of these countries that we've been looking at, labor markets were relatively well protected before the contraction. So this is an important element to keep in mind. We're going to be looking at all of these 6 or 7 countries, but all of them don't differ so much amongst themselves as they do when compared to this liberalized group. So when we take a look at Heritage Labor Index, which comprises all of these elements, rigidity of hours, difficulty of firing redundant employees, legally mandated notice periods, and we just compare this. So higher on the x-axis would mean more liberal labor markets, and lower would mean more protected labor markets. And when we take a look at this aggregate data for what has changed between 2007 and 2013, and we're just going to ignore the y-axis because we have no time for the y-axis, but if you just take a look left to right, you will see that almost no countries make a significant change, except the Czech Republic. You can see a sharp jump of the Czech Republic from the left to the right. And if you contextualize this is in 2009, so just in between these two graphs, you will see the Czech Republic jumping somewhere from the position of Sweden to somewhere to the position of Ireland. So if this is correct, if this aggregated data shows actual movements, real movements in legal codes, then this is an important predictor, not in the way that the Czech Republic unemployment behaves now, but the way it will behave at the next contraction. And these graphs show what happened in the past few years with unemployment. And you can also see blue line is always real GDP movement. So GDP corrected for inflation. And so, because this is the first time that I'm showing a graph like this during this presentation, maybe it should be pointed out that every country in the European Union had a real GDP contraction during 2009, except one, which is Poland. Poland just had a slowdown in growth. And almost all countries had either a slowdown in growth or a contraction during 2012. So this is an important thing to bear in mind. All of these countries were facing similar macroeconomic problems during 2009 and somewhat similar during 2012. And also to point out, when we take a look at Croatia, which is top right, you will see that it is almost the only country in the European Union now that never made it into positive growth throughout these 4 years. We almost broke even in 2011, but we still remain a fraction of a percentage below the zero line. Okay, so just to point out what I'm trying to say about labor protection and unemployment movement. All of these countries, all 6, 7 countries that we're looking at, have a slowly reducing unemployment in the good years during conjuncture years, and a slowly growing function during contractions and after contractions. Here is Poland, the only exception because unemployment was reduced rapidly right until the crisis. Romania and Slovakia, and you can't really see the differences until you compare this to these 2 countries. So this is what an LME country looks like. This is the USA and this is Estonia. So either a common law country or a country that has kindred labor policies. And you can see a sharp and rapid increase. So for the US, it was just about 4%. This would be 2007, and it was right up at almost 10% 2 years later. And Estonia was even worse. It moved from 5% to 17% in 2 years. So this is how a volatile labor market reacts. And this is what the Czech labor market will react. This is the way it will be next time a contraction hits the Czech Republic, if the data I've shown on the first 2 slides is correct. Okay, so now to take us through all the changes and to show the trends in labor market performance.
Thank you very much. I'll continue with the labor market reforms. If you look through the
Even if you are monitoring news on the television, you realize that what is common is constant protest within the labor market. And this is as a result of the impact of the crisis which has caused all this. So my hypothesis is that countries which adopted any reforms were able to manage the negative impact of the crisis effectively. However, with weak institutional structures, it will be difficult for countries to be able to achieve the impact of the reforms if the country do not have a good institutional structures, do not have good capacity to manage those reforms. It will be difficult for those countries who are implementing such reforms to achieve their goals. So we look at the kind of policies which were adopted by most of the countries, and you can see that within the period of 2009 to 2012, most of the countries that we are looking at adopted different reforms so that we'll be able to manage the impact of the crisis, which came as a surprise to most of them, because most of the countries were not prepared for it, because they thought that it's only in those countries like Spain, Portugal, Italy, where the people were going to be the victims. But at the end of the day, most of the countries became part of it. So countries have to embark on different reforms so that they'll be able to hedge the impact from coming into their countries. So we see one of the important policies which was adopted was the labor tax. There were various tax reforms, but because we are looking at the labor markets, I focused on the taxation which various governments used to manage their crisis, and also look at the flexibility of the working hours, just to ease the unemployment situation which was becoming overwhelming in most of the countries, and also to adopt tax exemptions, to also to give opportunity to companies and the private sectors to come out with new innovative ways, and to also acquire resources that will be able to come out of new employment and new work to ease the expanded labor market. And also look at the social welfare, and realize that social welfare became one of the victims of government policy, where most of the countries, especially when you talk about Romania, talk about Czech Republic, government have to cut down the social benefits which were given to these countries, the unemployed people, and which means that the labor markets became a victim for government means of raising funds to boost their GDP. What were these purpose of this policy meant to be? First of all, we have to look at it when intended to reduce the negative impact of the crisis. And as I've already said, the crisis brought about a lot of redundancy, meaning that companies have to lay off workers in order to make break-evens. So in order to hedge this impact, government has to come up with innovative means of tackling this. And you can see that in Germany, this was prominent, where government have to give incentives to companies so that they will be able to maintain workers who were going to be the victims. So government gave them incentives like tax holidays when it comes to paying taxes on social security benefits and insurance for their employees, and also to ensure reintegration of unemployment into the labor market. And this one was even common when it comes to countries like Romania was one of the countries which adopted such kind of policies where they have to give tax holidays to companies who employ people who were classified under long-term unemployment. For instance, companies who employ such people were given a tax holiday between 1 to 3 months for not paying their social security. So companies had to bear the social security taxes for these companies, and also to support the income of the vulnerable. The unfortunate thing is that even though there are policies to support the vulnerables in the form of unemployment benefits, some countries it was otherwise. They gave the benefits and added huge taxes on it. And for Romania, for instance, in 2010, the government had to put a tax of 15% on pension scheme, pension benefits, which means that even though if you increase pension rate and you put 15%, at the end of the day, what you will achieve, the impact will come back to zero. So even though you are increasing the benefits, the impact or the benefit that the pensioners are supposed to acquire, they don't make any positive compared to the issues which were going on in the market. And also to open up the private sector for job creation. In Belgium, for instance, government has to give tax incentives to companies, for instance, who employ youth under 19 years. So they give them 1% exemption so that they'll be able to come out with excess money to give to the private sector. So to equip the banks, the government have to give this tax exemption so that the companies will use that money to give it to the private sector to want to come out with a new companies or to expand their market. We look at the social benefit. Government gives social service contribution just to raise money and also to help the employers to come out or to employ more people into the market, the job market. For instance, we can say there's reduction of social service, as I said, for the Romanian government, even though there was a reduction in social benefit taxes that the companies were supposed to pay. For instance, in Germany, the contribution of the employers were reduced from 50% to 14%, just to ease the pressure that the employers were supposed to pay. So the employer portion was reduced by the government to help them to come out with, to reduce the cost of their labor. And also look at the social service tax exemption to companies who employ those who fall under long-term employment. As I said, for the Romanian issue was an example. And also in Germany, for instance, those companies who give people an opportunity to stay on the job have their revenue refunded either between 50 to 100%, depending on the period that they gave it to them. One area which, if you look at most of the 6 countries that we are looking at, especially from the Eastern European part, you realize that trade unions are weak when it comes to having the capacity to bargain with governments. And you realize that even though there were reforms, countries became did not have the capacity to dialogue with governments. We look at Czech, for instance. The government, the trade union were not able to dialogue. Because of that, the government reform could not come into effect at the time that it was supposed, as in 2010. And in Romania, you realize that because the trade union, they don't have the capacity to dialogue with the government decided to come out with the policy that they want, even without consulting them, because they knew that the institutions were not strong to contest whatever they would come out with. However, in Belgium, the reform on the collective bargaining was that they gave the trade union the capacity to dialogue with the employers instead of the government intervening. So the trade union have to dialogue on the term of services, the condition of service, and even the working hours that each employer is supposed to benefit. So during the crisis period, countries, industries who are going to lay off, they have to readjust the time period instead of laying the people off. And this negotiation was supposed to be done between the trade union within the work market with the employers. Now I look at the unemployment. We realize countries which adopted their policies were able to manage the unemployment situation, as I said in my hypothesis. However, we realize that unemployment situation within Europe is still high. As of 2000, the current as of April this year, this is what we have. If you look at the countries who are embarking on this, implementing this bailout process. For instance, the overall unemployment in Greece is 27%, Italy is around 12%, Portugal 17%, and Spain 26%. However, the most affected were the youth, as you and I are part of, very soon we go into the labor market, and you realize that in Greece, the youth unemployment rate is very high, which is at the point of 62.5%, followed by Spain, which is 54, and Portugal, 42.5, easily having the lowest. Even the lowest is still high, which is 40.5%. However, if you look at the general unemployment rates between 2006 and 2013, you see the pattern how various countries are performing. For instance, at the top we can see Croatia and Slovak Republic having the highest, above 14%, which is in the range of somewhere 15% for people who are classified as unemployed. And as usual, Germany have the lowest, which is below 6%. Why is this so? We can see that if you look at these two differences, you realize Germany embarked on reform way back in 2005, while Czech Republic had in between 2010 and 2011. However, because of institutional weaknesses and inability of the government and the trade union to dialogue, there is still a problem of implementation. Because of that, still the labor market reform has not been able to impact on the workforce. And we look at long-term unemployment. If you look at the long-term unemployment, when we talk about long-term unemployment, we are talking about people who have been unemployed within a period of 6 months and above. And you can see the pattern here, how the six countries are performing. Again, in 2012, you can see that Croatia still top the rate of unemployment situation, with Germany having the lowest. Now we come back to the youth within our country, within our areas. You can see that comparing this one to the rates here, these six countries are doing better. However, the rate still falls below the threshold which is expected within the European Union, which is somewhere 23%. But some can say most of the countries are above the 23%, which is supposed to at least be able to work upon. It's only Germany who works below 10%, still very high. So we look at how the government has been able to deal with, what kind of policies the government are using to tackle these unemployment situations. And you can see that one thing is the adoption of probation period. And if you look at the job market at the beginning of the crisis, one thing which was prevalent is that there was mismatch between the labor market and what the employers were looking for, especially when it comes to the technical aspect of it. Most of the countries which were coming out were based on the IT engineering, and the programs which were coming out of the universities were not able to match the demand of the employers. So government had to adopt a probationary period, and that is giving the students or the new graduates opportunity to learn from the job market. So companies have to employ this period before the free rate, and for them, between you and the employer, there's no contract because you are not classified as what? Employed. You are learning from the job market. So you can see in Romania, the probation period between 90 days to 120 days. For Slovakia, at the same, and even in Czech Republic also adopted all these measures just to help the students or the graduates to be able to get the requisite experience that they need so that they'll be able to gain employment. And also there was another measure, that is reduction of social benefits, which the government adopted so that these employers can also employ people at a cost which was lower, because we realized that the cost of labor was even way down on the companies. Again, we look at the reinvestment of social security contribution for companies. So the government decided at least to ease, even though the rate wasn't all that big, it is between 1% and 0.1. At least it was able to give the companies the boost so that we'll be able to employ more people into the labor market. So in my conclusion, there's a need for adoption of positive tax, which is the government should expand or give more tax exemptions or holidays to companies so that they'll be able to come out with innovative way of employing new labor into the market. Also the educational system, because of this mismatch within the job market, the educational system needs a good reform. And promotion of private sector participation is needed. But I would say that even though there was a lot of reform to bring about this labor market flexibility itself does not shows that at least the government will be able to reduce this unemployment rate. Because if you look at within the OECD, Denmark is the most flexible the most flexible labor market within the European Union. However, if you compare the tax rate within the unemployment rate in Denmark to, let's say, Austria and Germany, you can see that there's difference. For instance, in Austria, the unemployment rate is around 4.5%. In Denmark, they have almost about 14%. So, labor market flexibility itself does not serve as a panacea for unemployment reduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Josip.
Wait.
Thank you, Daniel.
In 2 minutes.
They really work hard, and I really want to.
It's your part in 2 minutes. Right?
All right.
Okay. So, moving on to one of these constricting elements, what did the fiscal response to the crisis look like in these countries? Again, you will have to take my word for it that there are LME and CME groupations in Europe. The problem, of course, being that for many of the countries from which all of you come, we're not sure what they are because they don't conform to these ideal types. Now, these were the named countries in 2001 when this project started. Germany, Japan, Switzerland, Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Austria, and Finland were CME countries. And Canada, Ireland, USA, UK, New Zealand, and Australia were the LME countries. And when you take a look at the way that their fiscal behavior replied to the crisis, you see huge differences that were predicted by the literature far before the crisis. This variable was known as aggregate demand management regime. So you see a growth, the average growth of public debt to GDP levels of 109% in LMEs. So hugely expansionary policy. And only 5% in CMEs. So let's take a look at what it looked like. So levels compared are from 2005 and 2011, hopefully showing levels before the financial crisis and economic contraction nexus, and after its full response. So you see high growth of public debt in Romania, 94%. You see moderate in Czech Republic, 43.5%. Relatively low in Croatia and Slovakia, 26 and 24% respectively. Low in Poland, only 19%, in Germany it was 17.5%, and in Belgium it was really negligible, 6%. But, what's the problem? This is standard, actually, methodology for fiscal compliance enacted by Europe, and it's problematic because it just doesn't work in recessions. If you have two countries spending or going into deficits at the same rate, or just remaining at exactly the same nominal amounts, and one of them goes into a heavy contraction of GDP, and the other one doesn't, it will seem like the first country had a huge increase in public debt, because it is always expressed as a ratio to GDP. So this is a problem. This is the most obvious thing to take from this table. So what can we do instead? We can look at cyclically adjusted structural deficits. So what actually happens in budgets of all of these countries? And here you can also see what I was saying in the beginning, the effect of the policy mainstream, whether it was a reaction to changing interest rates and secondary yields, or just the prevailing agenda. You see that all of these countries, or at least almost all of them, had a slowdown in growth or a contraction at the same time that they were reducing their deficits in 2012. And this is in a sharp contrast to what was going on in 2009, where you can see compliance with these institutional frameworks, doing exactly what, say, David Soskice said that they would do in 2007. So, in Poland, you have a slowdown in growth in 2009 and an immediate normal expansion of deficits. In response, just, your revenues are reduced when your GDP slows down, so you need to borrow more to keep in line with your current expenditures. Same thing happened in Czech Republic, but not in Croatia. Why not in Croatia? Because Croatia had one of the most responsible, if not the most responsible, fiscal policy. Sorry, this is Croatia, the top right. The most responsible fiscal policy during this contraction. This typifies CME behavior, but it is also devastating for what happens to aggregate demand. So for the GDP growth. And predictably enough, you can see GDP growth never making it past zero again. In Slovakia, you have similar to Polish and Czech experience, but with pretty good recovery in 2010-11. In Germany, somewhat similar to Croatia, an unflinching structural deficit in response to the contraction, and as in almost all of these countries, what can only be interpreted as austerity from 2010 onwards. And in Belgium, structural deficit. Perhaps the only country that structural deficit didn't really respond to this change in mainstream from 2010. And it did, of course, react normally in 2009. And this is Romania. You see it losing maneuvering space with the widening deficit before the crisis, unable to respond to the contraction, takes, of course, the bailout debt, and is forced to cut its structural deficit. So this is one of the things that turned up in the interviews. Mr. Jarosz said that austerity measures are, of course, necessary, especially in the public administration. Mr. Obremski said that freedom for Poland is needed in fiscal behavior, and Mr. Elsner suggested that public administration should be more efficient, but that does not mean that he supports any cuts in spending. Okay, so now, moving on from this fiscal behavior, Colin will show us how changes in tax codes were enacted.
Thank you, Yusuf. So, in my case, I will be really brief because, first of all, I don't have much time to go into details, and I really think that my colleagues works really hard and explain it really well. And so I will present the tax reform at the national level, and also I will just focus on the main trend because for me, my background is in politics, and sometimes hard data, graphics, and statistics are more confusing me than help me. So, all right. So the first tax reform was on direct taxations. It was on personal income. It was not a big surprise, but most states have increased personal income tax. For instance, in Belgium, we have a permanent solidarity levies, which are a progressive solidarity contribution on high incomes. Same measure is planned in Republic Czech. On the other hand, we have also states that have focused on measure to increase work incentives. So in one hand, it's true that such measure in Germany enable this country to sustain, to reach a sustained economic growth, but in the same time, in the meantime, we could say that is it the country in Europe where the condition of living is decreasing faster. All right. So about capital income, Russian measures have typically increased the tax burden on capital. So in Belgium, we have the instance of an increasing of 15 to 21%. Another measure was also corporate income tax. So we have here the instance with Romania. So what about social security contribution? So there were significant change, and this significant change mainly take the form of increase. So it's not a big surprise at all, always increasing. So we have different instances about Slovakia and Poland. So about indirect taxation as well, the standard VAT rates increase in most of the new and old democracy. And finally, about excise duty. Excise duty on tobacco, on fuel, on energy were increased in all of the country from the new and the old democracy. So for instance, in Germany, they were introduced a tax on nuclear fuel or airline tickets. In Belgium, Poland, Slovakia, we have also the same measure. And finally, also there have been measures to combat tax evasion and improve revenue collection. To conclude, the reforms that have been undertaken have clearly been influenced by the need for fiscal consolidation. In the domain of indirect taxation, there has been a clear generalized trend towards increasing the tax burden in the form of both higher rates and broader tax base. So, for my part, it was really brief and really short, straight to the point. Maybe now Yusuf will explain us different graphics about investment.
We'll go through investment graphs, yeah. Investments, much like almost any statistic that we show, the data that we deal with, they're expressed as a percentage of GDP. So during the recession times, again, they only slightly work. But in contrast to the rest of it, what you would expect to see with the contraction, if investments stay the same, would be for them to shoot up, because they're expressed again as percentage of GDP. But they don't, of course, because they're an important part of GDP. So in almost all of these countries, you see a dip in 2009, which is not as sharp as it would be if it was expressed in nominal terms, or as a ratio to something else. But still, you can see a dip in Belgian case, a slight recovery, in Czech case, in German case, in Polish case, in Slovakian case, but not in Croatian case. So we're hoping to see this function pick up right now. We've entered the European Union, investor confidence should pick up for Croatia, and we should write this out. And a part of the explanation of this graph would be that, of course, investment rates in Croatia were pretty high before the crisis, so it is only natural that they should fall quicker. Another thing that was suggested that we should show is the way that social spending works. We don't see two interesting stories here, but you can see the relative position, at least, of these countries. You see Belgium with the most generous percentage, followed by Germany, and grouped a bit under it are Czech Republic, Poland and Slovakia, and also there would be Romania and Croatia if OECD issued statistics on them, but we have to use different data here. Eurostat, this sharp increase in Croatian case, again, distortion because of GDP contraction. There was only a 3% actually increase during that year. Okay, so moving to the next important topic, the way that Euro membership and exchange rate mechanism membership constricts the options for any country to respond to the crisis. Mark Othello, these are 11 EU members that are not members of the EU, of the Eurozone. Mark Othello, you'll see those that devaluated more than 10% in 2009. So a measure that would have expanded the trade balance for these countries against Euro countries. And when you compare this data, so the percentage for which the currency was devaluated against the Euro, and you compare it to real GDP growth in that year, you see a very nice regression. So, large devaluators, such as Poland, at more than 20%, grew most. And the countries that stayed pegged to the Euro grew least. And yesterday, during the trial, I showed just the 4 non-Euro members that we're dealing with here, but then I felt kind of silly because I was drawing a trend line for 4 countries, so I just decided to omit it. And here you see on a larger sample the same thing. Field researchers interviewing politicians found mostly similar statements. They all feel that Euro is a good thing in the long run, but right now Poland needs to keep the zloty, and we also had Bremski saying that Euro is only in the interest of Germany and France. In conclusion, we have seen how institutional arrangements can constrict decisions and responses. We have seen trends in these responses, and we have seen the effect of the policy mainstream after 2010. And we have seen an important change in the Czech Republic, employment protection. So, the interesting thing to point out is that everybody will be acting in the same destructive way that Croatia has during this recession, in the next recession. So yes, you should welcome us into the European Union, but we should really welcome you into our macro policy. Thank you.